The sky over New Haven was the color of rust that morning, and Elena Voss stood at the edge of the mining pits and watched the Empire ships pass overhead like slow gray clouds. She was 11 years old then, and she did not yet know the word for what she felt. Later, she would call it shame. Later still, she would call it fuel. New Haven was not its real name. The humans who lived there had given it that name themselves, quietly, in their own homes, because the name the Empire had given the planet was a string of numbers and letters that meant nothing to anyone who had to live and die on its soil. To the Empire, it was Sector Outpost 4471C, a mining colony rich in tellurium ore, staffed by a labor population that the Empire's records simply called the Terran stock. The Terran stock had come from Earth 200 years before, in the Great Scattering, when human ships had fled a dying solar system and found new homes among the stars. For 100 years they had built their own small worlds in peace. Then the Empire came, vast and old and sure of itself, and it did not ask permission. It simply arrived, planted its flags, and began to take. By the time Elena was born, 3 generations of humans had lived under Empire rule. Most of them had never seen Earth, would never see it, and had grown up believing that the sky was supposed to be full of foreign ships and foreign law. But Elena's grandmother remembered a time before that. She used to tell Elena stories at night, quiet stories, about a Terran fleet that once flew free, about captains who answered to no emperor, about a flag that was blue and white and belonged to no one but the people who flew under it. "Where is that flag now?" Elena had asked her once. Her grandmother had looked toward the ceiling of their small house, as if she could see through it to the stars. "Hidden," she said, waiting. Elena did not understand what she meant. Not then. The mines took her grandmother's hands first, then her lungs, then, when Elena was 16, her life. The Empire doctors said it was old age. Elena knew better. She had seen the ore dust that hung in the air of the deep tunnels, had watched her grandmother cough at night until her whole body shook, had begged the overseers for better filtration masks, and been told that the quota came before comfort. The Empire did not hate the humans of New Haven. That was the strange, cold truth Elena learned as she grew older. The Empire did not think about them enough to hate them. They were a resource, like the ore itself, to be extracted as efficiently as possible and otherwise ignored. That kind of indifference cuts in a way that hatred does not. Hatred at least means you are seen. Elena's people were not seen. They were counted. She left the mines at 18, joined the small defense corps that the Empire allowed the colony to keep for show, and there she met a young engineer named Marcus Wren, a quiet, careful man who read old Terran history in his spare time, and who first said to her, in a low voice one night, "There are more of us than they know. Scattered, waiting, building." "Building what?" she asked. "A fleet," he said, "a real one, somewhere out past the Empire's charted borders. In the dark between the stars, humans have been building ships for 50 years. Quietly, patiently. My father worked on it before he died. He told me before he died, so that someone would still know." Elena did not believe him at first. It sounded like the kind of story her grandmother used to tell, a comfort for children, not a plan for grown men and women to act upon. But Marcus was not a man who lied for comfort. Over the months that followed, he showed her things. Coded messages hidden in old cargo manifests, supply routes that made no sense unless you knew what they were truly for, names of Terran engineers who had vanished from the Empire's records only to reappear, faintly, in whispered stories from freighter crews who had seen strange lights in empty systems. The Terran Republic, they called themselves, in the dark. Not a nation with a capital or a parliament that anyone had ever seen, but a promise, passed hand to hand, ship to ship, generation to generation. A fleet built in secret from parts smuggled out of 100 Empire shipyards, crewed by volunteers who left their families believing they were going to work a distant mining contract and never coming home, because coming home would have given away the secret. It took Elena 3 more years to earn Marcus's full trust, and through him, the trust of the ones who ran the network beneath the network. In that time, she watched New Haven bleed a little more each season. The Empire raised the ore quotas twice. It closed 2 of the colony's hospitals to save on maintenance costs. When a tunnel collapse killed 40 miners in a single afternoon, The Empire's local governor, a stiff, bored man named Prefect Elon Dre, did not visit the site. He sent a memo instead, expressing what his office called administrative regret, and reminded the colony that the monthly quota would not be adjusted for the loss of labor. Elena read that memo standing in the room where the bodies of the 40 miners had been laid out for their families to grieve over. She read it twice. Then she folded it very carefully and put it inside her jacket, and she carried it with her for the rest of her life, long after the paper had worn soft and gray from being folded and unfolded so many times. "We are not going to ask them for justice anymore," she told Marcus that night. "We are going to take it." It took 11 more years before Elena Voss stood on the bridge of anything larger than a shuttle. In that time, she rose through the hidden ranks of the Terran Republic's fleet, the way water rises in a slow flood, not through ambition, but because she refused to stop, because every time a door closed on her, she found the crack beneath it and pushed through. She was 34 years old when she was given command of her first real warship, a converted ore hauler with false hull plating and a name that meant nothing to anyone outside the network, the Second Chance. By then, the Republic's fleet was no longer a secret dream. It was 300 ships strong, hidden in a nebula the Empire's star charts marked as empty and unremarkable, a place called the Hollow, by the humans who had built their shipyards inside its drifting clouds of gas and dust, safe from Empire sensors. Elena had seen it with her own eyes the first time Marcus brought her there, and she had wept, quietly, in the dark of her shuttle, because her grandmother had been right. The flag had not died. It had only gone to sleep. The Republic had a council by then, too. A real one, made up of representatives from a dozen human colonies who had found each other in secret over the decades. They argued the way all councils argue, about strategy and supply and risk, but they agreed on one thing without exception. They would not strike first. Not out of fear, though fear was reasonable given the size of the Empire's true military, but out of something closer to hope. They wanted, more than anything, for the Empire to simply stop, to ease the quotas, to treat the colonies as something more than resources, to see them. So the Council decided, after long debate, to send a warning, one last warning, delivered openly, through official channels, by a Terran diplomat who would walk into the heart of Empire space, and tell them plainly what waited in the dark if they did not change course. Marcus Wren volunteered for that mission. Elena argued against it for 3 days. It was, she told him, very likely a one-way trip. The Empire did not take kindly to threats, and delivering one in person, unarmed, was close to suicide. "Someone has to say it to their faces," Marcus told her, the night before he left. "Not through a coded message they can pretend they never received. To their faces, Elena, so that when it happens, no one in that empire can ever say they were not warned." She could not argue with that. She only held him for a long time in the dim light of the Second Chance's cargo bay, and she made him promise to come back, and he made the kind of promise that people make when they both know it might not be true. The Empire's capital world was called Kaloth, a bright, ordered planet of glass towers and clean, wide avenues, where the ruling council of the Empire met in a great hall built from a stone so pale it seemed to glow even in shadow. Marcus Wren arrived there under a diplomatic pass arranged through years of careful, quiet Republic contacts inside the Empire's own bureaucracy. Humans and sympathetic non-humans alike, who had grown tired of watching the Empire grind down anyone too small to fight back. He stood before the Council of 12 on a cold, bright morning, a single human in a hall built for beings twice his height, and he told them the truth. He told them about the tunnel collapse that killed 40 miners, and the memo that came instead of comfort. He told them about the hospitals closed to save maintenance costs, about children who had never once in their lives seen a doctor who was not overworked past exhaustion. He told them, carefully and without exaggeration, that the descendants of Earth had not vanished into obedience the way the Empire's records suggested. They had built a fleet, a real one, hidden, patient, and now large enough that continuing to treat human colonies as disposable labor would carry a cost the Empire had not yet imagined. "We do not want war," Marcus said, and his voice did not shake, though his hands, folded before him, were cold as ice. "We want to be seen as people, change the way you govern our worlds, ease the quotas, open the hospitals, Recognize our right to speak for ourselves. Do this, and there will be no war at all. Refuse, and I promise you, the day will come when ships fly out of the dark that you did not know existed, and you will wish you had listened to one tired man standing alone in this hall. For a long moment, the Council of 12 said nothing. Then one of them, a tall, elegant being named Vorik Thess, who held the seat of Minister for Outer Colonies, began to laugh. It was not a cruel laugh, not exactly. It was the laugh of someone who found the whole idea simply absurd, the way a person might laugh at a child who claimed to have built a spaceship out of blankets and chairs. A fleet, Minister Thess said, still smiling, built by miners and farmers, hidden from an empire that spans 4,000 star systems and commands the largest and most advanced navy in known space. Tell me, human, do you truly believe we have not scanned every corner of our own territory? Do you believe your people, who cannot even keep their own tunnels from collapsing, have somehow built starships capable of challenging us? Soft laughter spread through the hall, not loud, but enough. Enough to tell Marcus that every word he had said had landed like rain on stone, wetting the surface and running off without ever soaking in. Prefect Elon Dre, the same colonial governor who had sent the memo about administrative regret, stood among the council's advisors that day, and it was he who spoke next, his voice mild and almost bored. The Terran stock has always told itself stories, he said. Stories are how the powerless comfort themselves. I have administered New Haven for 11 years. I know these people. They are hard workers, and they are, on the whole, no trouble at all. This talk of hidden fleets is theater, nothing more, meant to frighten us into loosening quotas we have every right to set. I would advise the council to ignore it entirely. Marcus looked from face to face across that vast pale hall, and he understood, with a coldness that settled into his chest and stayed there, that no one in the room believed him. Not because his evidence was weak. He had brought evidence, careful and specific, ship designs and supply chain records and testimony that any competent investigator could have verified within a week. They did not believe him because they had already decided, long before he ever walked through those doors, that humans were not capable of the thing he was describing. It was not a conclusion they had reached by looking at the facts. It was a belief, so old and so comfortable, that no fact could move it. This is your final warning, Marcus said again, quieter now, because he could see it was hopeless, but he had promised himself he would say it plainly, no matter what. Not a threat, a warning. Change how you treat us, or the fleet you refuse to believe in will come, and it will not come to ask politely a second time. Minister Thess waved a hand, the gesture of someone dismissing a servant. Escort our guest back to his ship, he said. And someone please inform the Outer Colonies office that quota compliance on Sector 4471C is due for review next quarter. I believe it can, in fact, be raised. Marcus Wren left the great pale hall of Kaloth's council with the sound of soft laughter following him down the long corridor. And he understood, walking back to his ship under the bright, ordered, glass-towered sky of the Empire's capital, that he had done everything a person could do. He had spoken the truth to the faces of the powerful, plainly and without exaggeration, and it had changed nothing at all. He sent one message back to the Hollow before his ship left Empire space. It was short. They did not listen. They will not listen. It is time. Elena Voss received that message standing on the bridge of the Second Chance, and she read it 3 times before she let herself feel anything about it. Around her, the ship's small crew waited in silence, watching her face, because they all understood what those 5 words meant for their lives, and the lives of everyone they loved. She thought of her grandmother, and the stories told in the dark. She thought of the memo about administrative regret, worn soft from years of folding and unfolding inside her jacket. She thought of the 40 miners whose names the Empire's records did not even bother to list individually, only as a single line: labor loss, tunnel collapse, quota unaffected. She thought of Marcus, and the promise he had made her, and whether he would be able to keep it. Then she opened a channel to the full council of the Terran Republic, 300 ships strong, hidden inside the drifting gas clouds of the Hollow, built in secret over 50 patient years by people who had never stopped believing that the flag was only sleeping and not dead. They were warned, she said, and her voice did not shake. though her hands, resting on the edge of the command console, were cold as ice. Plainly, and to their faces, exactly as we agreed. They chose to laugh. They chose to raise the quotas instead of easing them. They have made their decision for us. She paused, and in that pause she felt the weight of every year since she was 11 years old, and stood at the edge of the mining pits, watching Empire ships pass overhead like slow gray clouds, feeling a shame she did not yet have a word for. "Prepare the fleet," Elena Voss said. "We are going to Kaloth." Far across the galaxy, in the pale glass towers of the Empire's capital, Minister Vorik Thess sat down to a fine dinner that evening and remarked to a colleague, with mild amusement, that the Terran diplomat's little performance had been almost charming in its earnestness. Prefect Elon Dre, back on New Haven a week later, signed the order raising the ore quota by 15% and included in his report to Kaloth a note that colony morale, while somewhat strained, remained fully manageable. Neither man gave the warning another thought. In the drifting gray clouds of the hollow, 300 ships began, quietly and without fanfare, to power their engines. The waiting was over. The hollow did not look like the birthplace of a war. From the outside, it was only a slow, drifting cloud of gas and dust, faintly glowing in shades of violet and dull red, the kind of place a star chart marked as empty, and moved on from without a second thought. That was exactly why the builders of the Terran Republic had chosen it, 50 years before Elena Voss was born. Empire sensors, tuned to search for the clean metal signatures of shipyards and the bright heat of engines, slid right past the hollow's churning clouds, fooled by 50 years of careful work meant to make the place look like nothing at all. Inside, it was a nation. Elena walked the long corridor of the flagship 2 days before the fleet was set to leave, and she passed families. That was the thing that struck visitors most, the ones few in number who ever came from outside, smuggled in through the same secret channels that had once carried Marcus Wren's warning to Kaloth. They expected a military base, cold and gray and full of soldiers. What they found instead was closer to a small, floating city. There were schools built into converted cargo holds, where children who had never seen open sky learned mathematics and history from teachers who had themselves been born inside the hollow and never once set foot on solid ground. There were gardens grown under soft artificial light, rows of green vegetables tended by old men, and women too frail for fleet duty, but who refused to sit idle, while there was still dirt to dig and food to grow. There was a small chapel with no particular religion attached to it, just a quiet room where anyone could go and sit and think, and on its wall, painted by hand many years ago and touched up carefully every decade since, was the old blue and white flag that Elena's grandmother used to describe in her bedtime stories. Elena stopped in front of that flag for a long moment, the way she always did when she passed it. She thought of her grandmother's hands, roughened and cracked from the mines, resting on Elena's shoulder as she whispered those old stories in the dark. She thought that her grandmother had died still believing the flag was only a story, never knowing it was real, never knowing that men and women exactly like her had spent their whole lives keeping it alive in secret, so that one day it would fly again. "You always stop here," said a voice behind her. Elena turned. It was Captain Rin Okoye, commander of the destroyer Longview, one of the oldest and most respected officers in the fleet, a woman with silver hair and a face that had seen 60 years of hard work and harder losses. Rin had been born inside the hollow, one of the first generation, and she had never seen the sky of any world but this one, this hidden home, built from smuggled parts and stubborn hope. "It reminds me why we're doing this," Elena said. Rin nodded slowly. "My mother helped weld the first hull plating that ever flew in this fleet," she said. "She used to say the same thing you're thinking right now, that it isn't really about winning, it's about being seen, about someone, somewhere, finally having to look at us and admit we exist. Do you think Kaloth will ever really see us?" Elena asked, "even after this?" Rin considered the question for a long moment, her eyes on the old painted flag. "I think," she said finally, "that they will see us whether they want to or not. What they decide to do about it afterward, that part I can't promise you." 2 systems away, on a world called Arath that belonged fully to the Empire and had never known a single day of war in living memory, A young Empire naval officer named Commander Kes Belerian was enjoying, without knowing it, one of the last quiet days of his old life. Kes was 29 years old, sharp-featured and quick to smile, the kind of officer who had been marked early for promotion, and who had never once had to fight for anything he wanted. He served aboard the Empire cruiser Dominion's Reach, part of the 3rd Home Fleet stationed near Kaloth itself, the pride of the Empire's inner defenses, though pride was perhaps too strong a word for a fleet that had not fired a shot in anger in over 200 years. The Empire's true wars, the ones fought against alien rivals near its outer borders, were fought by other fleets, far away, in systems most Home Fleet officers would never visit. The 3rd Home Fleet existed mostly for ceremony, parades, honor guards for visiting dignitaries, a symbol of Empire strength rather than a working instrument of it. That evening, Kes sat with 3 other young officers in a dockside restaurant that overlooked Arath's wide, calm harbor, drinking something sweet and local, laughing about nothing in particular. One of them, a woman named Sella Prax, mentioned the strange little scene at the council hall a few weeks back, the human diplomat who had walked in and announced, with a completely straight face, that the Terran colonies had built a secret fleet somewhere out in unclaimed space. "My cousin works in the council secretariat," Sella said, still laughing. She said the man was completely serious, stood there in front of the whole council of 12, and said it like he actually believed it. "Poor thing. Probably did believe it," said another officer, a heavy-set man named Torvin Ash. "You know how these colony people get. No real navy, no real defense, so they tell themselves stories to feel less small. My grandfather used to say, the Terran stock has more imagination than sense." Kes laughed along with the others, though something in him, some small quiet part he did not examine too closely, felt a flicker of unease at the joke. He had grown up on stories of Empire greatness, had been taught since childhood that the Empire's 4,000 star systems and its ancient unmatched navy made it simply impossible for any lesser power to threaten it seriously. It was not arrogance exactly, not to him. It was just how the universe was arranged. The Empire was large and old and strong, everyone else was not. Still, he found himself asking, quietly, almost to himself, has anyone actually gone and checked? The area the diplomat mentioned, I mean. The unclaimed sectors past the outer relay stations. Sella shrugged. Why would we? It's empty space. Nobody lives out there. There's nothing to check. That's rather the point of hiding something, Kes said, and he meant it half as a joke, but the words sat oddly in his own mouth after he said them. Torvin Ash laughed loudest of all. Kes Belerian, secret military strategist, he said, raising his glass. To the Terran Fleet, wherever it may be hiding, may we all live to see it, so we can finally stop hearing about it. They laughed again and drank, and the evening went on exactly as thousands of evenings had gone on before it, in a city that had never known war, under a sky that had never once seen an enemy ship, in an empire so old and so certain of its own permanence that it had genuinely stopped imagining what it might feel like to be wrong. Back in the Hollow, 300 ships prepared for war the way people prepare for the ending of one life and the beginning of another, with equal parts fear and relief. Elena spent her last full day before departure the way she suspected many of her officers were spending theirs, saying goodbyes that might turn out to be permanent, though no one said that part out loud. She found Marcus Wren in the small medical bay of the flagship, still recovering from the exhaustion of his journey back from Kaloth, thinner than she remembered him, his eyes carrying the particular tiredness of a man who has said an important true thing to people who refuse to hear it. "You look terrible," she told him, sitting beside his cot. "You should have seen the room," he said, managing a small, tired smile. "Pale stone walls, ceiling so high you could barely see it, and 12 beings looking down at me like I was a child, telling them a bedtime story." He shook his head slowly. "I did everything right, Elena. I told them the truth plainly. I gave them evidence. I gave them a way out that cost them nothing but a little humility. And they laughed." "I believe you," Elena said. "No one is blaming you for how they chose to respond." "I keep thinking about the moment the prefect started talking," Marcus said, his voice quiet now, almost to himself. "Dre, the one who runs New Haven. He talked about us like we were livestock that had gotten unusually good at pretending to be people. Not cruel, exactly. Worse than cruel, bored, like the whole conversation was beneath his attention. Elena reached out and took his hand, the way she had done the night before he left for Kaloth, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. "I'm afraid," Marcus admitted finally. "Not of dying. I made my peace with that a long time ago, the day I volunteered. I'm afraid of what we become, once the fighting starts. I'm afraid that in trying to make them see us as people, we end up doing something that makes it easier for them to see us as monsters instead." Elena thought about that for a long time before she answered. It was, she knew, the same fear that sat quietly underneath every conversation the Republic's Council had held in the weeks leading up to this moment. War against an indifferent, arrogant power was one kind of danger. Becoming, in the process, the very thing you had set out to prove you were not, was another kind entirely, quieter and harder to see coming. "Then we hold on to that fear," she said finally. "We don't let it stop us, but we don't let it go either. The day we stop being afraid of becoming what they think we already are, that's the day we actually become it." Marcus squeezed her hand. "Promise me something," he said. "Anything. Promise me that whatever happens out there, you'll remember why we're doing this. Not for revenge, not because we hate them, because we want, finally, to be seen as people who deserve better than quotas and memos about administrative regret." "I promise," Elena said, and she meant it with everything she had. The Fleet Council met one final time before departure, in a chamber built inside the largest asteroid the Hollows builders had hollowed out over 50 patient years. A chamber that could seat every ship captain in the fleet at once. 300 men and women representing every human colony that had ever quietly sent a volunteer, a spare part, a coded message of support into the dark. Admiral Torres Cade, the fleet's supreme commander, an old soldier who had spent 40 years building this navy from smuggled scraps and stubborn faith, stood before them all and spoke plainly, the way Marcus Wren had spoken to the Empire's Council, except this time, every single person listening believed every word. "We do not go to Kaloth to conquer," Admiral Cade said, his voice carrying easily across the vast stone chamber. "We do not go to slaughter. We go to be seen, and to make clear, in a way that cannot be laughed off or dismissed with a memo, that the price of ignoring human lives has finally come due. Every ship in this fleet will follow strict rules of engagement. We strike military targets. We protect civilians, Empire and human alike, wherever we possibly can. We do not become the thing we have spent 50 years fighting against." He paused, letting his eyes move slowly across the gathered captains, resting for a moment on Elena, on Rin Okoye, on dozens of faces that had each carried their own version of the same long, quiet grief. 50 years ago, he said, a handful of engineers and dreamers looked at an empire that spanned 4,000 star systems and decided, against every reasonable calculation, that it was still worth trying to build something better. They are gone now, most of them, buried in the walls of this very asteroid, but their work carried us here, to this moment, to this fleet. His voice softened, just slightly. "Let us finish what they started, and let us do it in a way they would be proud of." 300 captains rose to their feet together, and the sound of it, 300 chairs sliding back at once in that vast stone chamber, echoed like something close to thunder. The final hours passed the way final hours always do, too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Elena stood on the bridge of the flagship, the second chance long since retired to a support role, and replaced by a larger vessel called the Grandmother's Promise, named, at Elena's own quiet insistence, for a woman who had died in the mines of New Haven, still believing in nothing more solid than a bedtime story. Marcus stood beside her, well enough now to walk, though still pale from his ordeal. Around them, the bridge crew moved through their final checks with the calm, practiced efficiency of people who had trained for this moment for years, without knowing exactly when it would come. "Hyperspace calculations locked," said the navigator, a young woman named Priya Anand who had been born, like Rin Okoye, inside the drifting clouds of the Hollow, and had never once seen open sky. "Course set for the Kaloth system. Estimated arrival, 4 hours." Elena looked out at the view screen, where hundreds of Republic ships hung silently against the violet glow of the Hollow's clouds, waiting for her order. waiting for 50 years of patient hidden work to finally become something the whole galaxy would have to acknowledge. She thought of her grandmother's hands. She thought of the memo, worn soft from folding, still tucked inside the jacket she wore even now, beneath her uniform. She thought of Minister Thessa's soft laughter, and Prefect Dre's bored, dismissive voice, and the 40 miners whose names had been reduced to a single administrative line. "All ships report ready, Admiral," said the communications officer. Elena Voss took a slow breath, and beside her, Marcus Wren reached out and took her hand one final time before the engines engaged. "For every voice they refused to hear," Elena said quietly, "and every warning they laughed away." She raised her hand and gave the order. "Engage hyperspace drive. Fleet, on my mark. All ships together." The stars outside the view screen stretched into long, bright lines, and then vanished entirely, swallowed by the strange folded light of hyperspace travel. 300 ships, and everyone aboard them hurtling now toward a bright, glass-towered world that had no idea, none at all, that its final warning had just run out. Commander Kes Belerian was on duty aboard the Dominion's Reach when the sensors first flickered, with something the Third Home Fleet systems had no proper name for. It was 2 a.m. by the ship's clock, the quiet hour when even a fleet stationed for ceremony rather than war kept only a skeleton watch. Kes had drawn the late shift that week, a small inconvenience he had grumbled about to Sella Prax over dinner, never imagining it would place him in the one seat aboard the ship where he would be the very first person in the entire Empire to understand what was coming. The sensor operator on duty, a young technician named Ordis Fell, called out first, his voice carrying the particular confusion of someone seeing a reading his training had never prepared him for. "Sir, I don't know what I'm getting." Mass readings at the outer edge of the system, large, very large, multiple contacts, appearing simultaneously. Kes crossed the bridge in 3 quick steps, leaning over the technician's shoulder to look at the display himself. The readings scrolling across the screen made no immediate sense. Dozens of contacts, then hundreds, blooming into existence at the edge of the Kaloth system's outer boundary all at once. The unmistakable signature of hyperspace drives, disengaging in perfect, practiced unison. "That's not possible," Kes said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Nothing arrives like that. Not even our own fleets move with that kind of coordination." "Sir," Ordis said, and his voice had gone tight and thin, I'm counting over 300 separate contacts, all military profile, all closing on an intercept course for Kaloth itself." For one long, terrible moment, Kes Belerian stood frozen on the bridge of a ship built for ceremony and parade, and he thought, with a strange, distant clarity, of a joke he had made 3 weeks ago in a dockside restaurant, raising a glass to a fleet he had never truly believed existed. "May we all live to see it, so we can finally stop hearing about it." "Sound General Quarters," he said, and his voice, when it came, surprised him with how steady it sounded, though his hands, gripping the edge of the console, had gone cold. "Contact Fleet Command immediately. Tell them." He stopped, searching for words that would not sound insane, and finding none. "Tell them the Terran Fleet is real. Tell them it's here." 300 ships dropped out of hyperspace together, at the edge of the Kaloth system, and for one breathless, silent moment, nothing happened at all. On the bridge of the Grandmother's Promise, Elena Voss watched the bright, distant star that was Kaloth's sun resolve itself out of the strange folding light of hyperspace travel, and beyond it, faint but growing clearer by the second, the pale glowing dot that was the Empire's capital world itself. She had trained for this moment for 11 years, had imagined it 1,000 times in the quiet hours before sleep, and none of her imagining had prepared her for how it actually felt to see it. It felt, more than anything, like arriving somewhere she had always been meant to arrive. "All ships report successful transit," said Priya Anand from the navigation station, her voice tight with concentration but steady. "Fleet formation holding. No damage, no stragglers." "Sensor contacts?" Elena asked. "Empire Third Home Fleet, positioned near Kaloth's inner defense perimeter," came the reply from the tactical officer, a broad-shouldered man named Dale Corrin, who had spent 15 years memorizing every Empire fleet deployment the Republic's spies had ever managed to smuggle out. 12 capital ships, roughly 40 escort vessels, ceremonial fleet, Admiral, not built for a real engagement. He paused, checking his readings again. They're already scrambling, though. Someone over there has clearly figured out we're not a sensor glitch. Elena felt Marcus's hand find hers briefly, just for a moment, there and then gone. A small private gesture in the middle of a bridge full of people about to go to war. Signal the fleet, Elena said. Hold formation. We advance on Kaloth at standard approach speed. No weapons fire unless fired upon first. Dale, open a broad channel. I want every ship in that home fleet, and every ear on Kaloth itself, to hear what I have to say. Channel open, Admiral. Elena straightened, and for a moment she thought of her grandmother's voice in the dark, telling stories of a flag that was only sleeping, and of Marcus standing alone in a vast pale hall telling the truth to people who refused to hear it, and of 40 miners reduced to a single administrative line. This is Admiral Elena Voss of the Terran Republic Fleet, she said, and her voice, broadcast now across every channel the Empire's capital system used, carried further than any voice from New Haven ever had before. 3 weeks ago, our diplomat stood before your Council of 12 and warned you plainly that the descendants of Earth had built a fleet capable of reaching your capital. You laughed. You raised the quotas on our colonies instead of easing them. You chose not to believe us. She paused, letting the silence stretch, imagining the pale glass towers of Kaloth far below, imagining Minister Thess and Prefect Dre hearing these words for the first time, and understanding, all at once, exactly what they had dismissed. We are not here to conquer your capital, Elena continued. We are not here to slaughter your people. We are here because you left us no other way to be heard. Stand down your home fleet. Open a genuine channel for negotiation with representatives of the Terran Republic, and this can end today, without further bloodshed. Refuse, and we will demonstrate, as clearly as we must, that the price of ignoring us has finally come due. She closed the channel, and the bridge of the grandmother's promise fell into a tense, waiting silence. Aboard the Dominion's Reach, Kes Balerion listened to Admiral Voss's broadcast with a strange, cold feeling settling into his chest, a feeling he did not have a name for yet, but would later come to recognize as the precise moment his entire understanding of the universe cracked open. Fleet Admiral Boran Kes, commander of the Third Home Fleet, and no relation to Kes Balerion despite the shared name, a broad, proud man who had spent his entire 40-year career preparing for parades rather than battles, stood on the bridge of his flagship and stared at the tactical display with an expression Kes Balerion had never seen on a superior officer before. It was the expression of a man watching the floor of his own certainty give way beneath him. Sir, Kes said carefully. Orders? Admiral Boran Kes did not answer immediately. He was, Kes Balerion realized with a fresh jolt of unease, actually considering the Terran Admiral's offer, considering standing down. Then a new channel opened, priority override, direct from Kaloth's council hall itself. Minister Vorik Thess's voice, no longer carrying the mild amusement of 3 weeks earlier, cut across the bridge cold and sharp. This is the Council of 12, Fleet Admiral Boran Kes. You will not stand down. You will not negotiate with rebellious colonial labor. Engage the intruder fleet immediately, and drive it from Empire space. That is a direct order from the Council. Admiral Boran Kes closed his eyes for one brief moment, and Kes Balerion, watching, understood that his commander knew, in that instant, exactly how badly outmatched they truly were. 12 capital ships built for parades against 300 that had crossed the width of known space in perfect silent coordination. But an order from the Council of 12, delivered in that cold, absolute tone, was not something even a fleet admiral could refuse. All ships, Admiral Boran Kes said, his voice heavy but steady, prepare to engage. May the Empire's strength carry us through. The first shots of the war came not from the Terran Fleet, but from the Empire's Third Home Fleet, a spread of long-range plasma torpedoes launched in a ragged, hurried volley by ships whose crews had trained for parade formations and honor guards rather than real combat. On the grandmother's promise, Dale Corrin's voice cracked across the bridge. Incoming fire, Admiral. They've engaged. Evasive pattern. All ships, Elena ordered, her voice cutting through the sudden tension like a blade. Return fire. targeting weapons systems and engines only. I want their ships disabled, not destroyed, wherever possible. Watch for escape pods and give them clear passage. The Republic fleet's point defense systems, built and refined over 50 patient years by engineers who had never stopped dreaming of this exact moment, tracked and intercepted the incoming torpedoes with a precision that the Empire's third home fleet had simply never had cause to develop. Explosions bloomed silently in the dark of space, harmless now, extinguished before they ever reached their targets. Then the Republic fleet answered. It was not in the end much of a battle. The third home fleet's 12 capital ships, magnificent and gleaming and built over generations for ceremony rather than survival, found their shields overwhelmed within the first 6 minutes of real engagement. Republic gunners, trained specifically to disable rather than destroy, targeted engine sections and weapons batteries with a discipline that surprised even some of their own commanders. Watching Empire ships go dark and drift, defeated but largely intact, their crews alive, inside hulls that had been carefully, deliberately spared a killing blow. Aboard the Dominion's Reach, Kespelarian felt the ship shudder as its main weapons battery took a direct, precise hit, disabling it in a single controlled strike that left the rest of the hull and every person inside it completely untouched. "Weapons are down, sir," Ordesfell reported, his voice shaking. "Engines are down. We're dead in the water, sir. But the hull's intact. Life support's fine. They didn't try to kill us." Kespelarian stood on the darkened bridge of his crippled ship and looked out at the view screen, where the vast silent shapes of the Republic fleet moved past them, unhurried, controlled, terrifyingly disciplined, and he understood, with the same cold clarity he had felt when the first sensor readings appeared, that everything he had ever been told about the Terran stock, about colony people who had more imagination than sense, had been catastrophically, dangerously wrong. "They could have killed us," he said quietly, almost to himself. "All of us, right now, and they chose not to." No one on the bridge answered him. There was nothing to say. Around the crippled ships of the Third Home Fleet, drifting dark and defeated but alive, the Republic fleet continued its slow, deliberate advance toward Kaloth, and far below, in the pale glass towers of the Empire's capital, the Council of 12 finally understood, all at once and far too late, exactly what their laughter had cost them. The Council of 12 met in emergency session that same day, in the same pale stone hall where Marcus Wren had stood alone and been laughed at 3 weeks before. This time there was no laughter. There was shouting, and fear, and the particular ugly panic of powerful people discovering, all at once, that the ground beneath them was not as solid as they had believed. "How?" demanded Minister Vorik Thess, his composed elegance cracking for the first time in living memory. "Did 300 warships cross the width of Empire space without a single sensor station registering their approach?" "They did not cross our space, Minister," answered General Rael Vantor, the Empire's chief of military intelligence, a tall, gaunt woman whose career had, until that morning, been built almost entirely on decades of correctly predicting the movements of the Empire's known rivals. "Our best analysis suggests they built and staged the entire fleet inside the Hollow Nebula, a region our own charts marked as empty 50 years ago and never rechecked. They did not need to cross our space undetected. They simply built, where we had already decided there was nothing worth looking at." 50 years, Thess repeated, his voice hollow. "They have been building this for 50 years, and no one thought to look." "With respect, Minister," General Vantor said, "no one thought to look because no one believed it was possible. We did not fail to detect them because our sensors are weak. We failed because our assumptions told us the search was unnecessary before we ever began it." Prefect Elon Dre, seated near the back of the chamber, said nothing at all. He was thinking, though he would never have admitted it aloud in that room, of a memo he had signed some years before, expressing administrative regret for the deaths of 40 miners, and of the folded, worn piece of paper that a Terran diplomat had described to the Council with such quiet, controlled anger. He had not connected the two things until this very moment, sitting in a chamber gone suddenly cold with fear, and the realization sat in his stomach like a stone. Minister Thess turned to the wide view screen at the front of the chamber, where the tactical situation over Kaloth played out in real time, a scattered ring of disabled Empire ships drifting dark around a slow, unbroken wall of Republic vessels, holding position at the edge of orbital range. "They have not fired on the capital itself," General Vantor observed. "They have disabled our home fleet, all 12 capital ships, without a single confirmed fatality that our own damage reports can find. They are, as far as I can determine, deliberately avoiding civilian and non-combat casualties." "Then what do they want?" Thess demanded. "They already told us, Minister," General Vantor said quietly. "3 weeks ago, and again this morning. They want to be heard." Aboard the Grandmother's Promise, the mood on the bridge was not one of celebration. Elena Voss stood watching the tactical display, the ring of disabled Empire ships drifting silent and dark around her fleet's careful, restrained blockade, and she felt none of the triumph she had half expected to feel after 50 years of waiting for this exact moment. "Casualty reports?" she asked quietly. "Minimal, Admiral," Dale Corrin replied. "Our own fleet, 3 wounded. No fatalities. Empire forces. We're still confirming, but early estimates suggest under 20 fatalities across all 12 capital ships, mostly from crews stationed directly at disabled weapons batteries. Given the scale of the engagement, it's..." He paused, searching for the right word. "It's remarkably light, Admiral. Our people did exactly what they trained for." Elena nodded slowly, but the tightness in her chest did not ease. 20 lives, however few compared to what might have been, were still 20 lives. 20 families, somewhere in the Empire, who would receive news today that would break something in them permanently. She thought of the 40 miners on New Haven, and the single administrative line that had recorded their deaths, and she made herself hold both truths at once. That restraint mattered, and that even restrained violence still cost something real. "Send the wounded Empire crews to their nearest medical facilities," she ordered. "Full assistance from our own medical ships, if theirs are overwhelmed. I want it recorded, clearly, in every log this fleet keeps, that we treated their wounded the same as our own." "Yes, Admiral." Marcus, standing beside her, watched the tactical display with an expression she recognized, the same tired weight he had carried back from Kaloth 3 weeks before, though now it was mixed with something else, something almost like relief. "They heard us," he said quietly. "For the first time in 50 years, they actually heard us." "They heard our weapons," Elena said. "That's not quite the same thing as hearing us." "No," Marcus agreed, "but it's a start, and now they have to decide what happens next, because they can no longer pretend we don't exist." The decision, when it came, did not come easily, and it did not come from the council chamber first. It came from the streets of Kaloth itself, where news of the battle had spread within hours despite the council's best efforts to control the story, and where ordinary Empire citizens, most of whom had never given a single thought to the Terran colonies in their entire lives, found themselves suddenly forced to reckon with what their government had been doing in their name. A young Empire journalist named Saela Rini, who had spent years covering minor colonial administration stories that no one important ever read, managed to obtain a copy of Prefect Elon Dre's memo about the New Haven tunnel collapse, the same worn document Marcus Wren had described to the council 3 weeks before. She published it that evening, alongside a simple, direct account of what Marcus Wren had actually said in his warning, and what the council had actually done in response. The reaction across Kaloth's glass towers and wide avenues was immediate, and, to the council's evident surprise, not entirely in their favor. Crowds gathered outside the council hall itself by the following morning, not violent but insistent, demanding to know why a colony that had lost 40 workers to a single tunnel collapse had received a quota increase instead of aid, why a diplomat who had come in good faith with a genuine warning had been laughed out of the chamber, why an empire that prided itself on 4,000 years of civilized rule had allowed things to reach the point where warships had to arrive at the capital itself before anyone in power would listen. Kes Belerian, released from the crippled Dominion's reach and recovering at a medical facility on Kaloth, alongside dozens of his own crew, watched the news coverage with a strange, hollow feeling in his chest. He thought of Torvin Ash's joke in the dockside restaurant, and Sela Prax's careless laughter, and his own small, uneasy question that no one had bothered to answer. He thought of the moment aboard his own crippled ship when he had realized the Republic fleet could have killed every person aboard, and had chosen, deliberately, not to. They could have destroyed us completely, he said quietly to Ortis Fell, who sat in the medical bed beside his own, recovering from a minor wound. All 12 ships, thousands of lives, and they didn't. What kind of enemy does that? Ortis did not have an answer either, but later that day, when a Republic medical officer came through the facility checking on wounded Empire crew members, treating them with the same careful attention given to her own fleet's wounded, Kes found himself watching her work, with something that was no longer quite hatred, and no longer quite fear, but something closer to a question he had never before had reason to ask himself. What if they were right, and we were the ones who had it backward all along? It was General Vantor in the end, who convinced the Council to change course, not through appeals to conscience, which she suspected would carry little weight, but through cold, practical argument. We cannot win this, she told the Council of 12, standing in the same pale hall where Marcus Wren had once stood alone. Our home fleet is disabled. Our true military strength is committed at the outer borders, fighting wars that took decades to prepare for, and cannot be recalled to defend the capital for weeks at minimum. In that time, this Terran Fleet, which has already demonstrated both overwhelming capability and, notably, restraint it did not have to show, could do whatever it wished to this system. It has not. It is asking, again, to be heard. I would strongly advise the Council to finally do so, before our restraint runs out, along with theirs. Minister Thess sat in silence for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the mild amusement it had held 3 weeks before. Open a channel, he said, to Admiral Voss, directly. Tell her the Council of 12 is prepared to negotiate. The channel opened aboard the Grandmother's Promise late that evening, ship time, and Elena Voss stood to receive it with Marcus at her side, the two of them facing a view screen that showed, for the first time, the full assembled Council of Kaloth, no longer laughing, no longer bored, no longer looking down at a single human diplomat from a height of easy, unearned certainty. Admiral Voss, Minister Thess said, and something in his voice, some genuine effort at humility that had clearly cost him a great deal to summon, made Elena believe, for the first time, that this conversation might actually matter. The Council of 12 is prepared to discuss the concerns your diplomat raised. All of them. Openly and in good faith. Elena looked at Marcus, and she saw in his tired, worn face the same thing she felt in her own chest, a complicated mixture of vindication and grief and cautious, fragile hope. Then let's begin, she said, with the memo about New Haven's 40 miners, and the administrative regret that was offered instead of help. I have carried a copy of that memo for 11 years, Minister. I would like, finally, for someone in that room to explain to me directly why it was written the way it was. For the first time in the recorded history of the Empire's relationship with its human colonies, the Council of 12 did not laugh, did not dismiss, did not look away. Minister Vorik Thess closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, he looked, for the first time, like a man who understood exactly what his silence and his laughter had cost, not just his empire, but the people he had spent his entire career refusing to see. Tell me, he said quietly. I am listening now, Admiral. I promise you, I am finally listening. The negotiations that followed lasted 11 days, and they were not easy, and they were not clean, and more than once, Elena Voss came close to believing they would fail entirely. But they did not fail, and the reason they did not fail was not diplomacy alone. It was the quiet, steady presence of everything that had happened above Kaloth, the dark, drifting shapes of 12 disabled Empire ships still visible on every sensor screen in the capital. A permanent, undeniable reminder that the world people like Minister Thess had once ordered was gone, and a new one, whether they liked it or not, had already begun. Marcus Wren sat at the negotiating table this time, not alone in a vast pale hall meant to make one small human feel smaller still, but beside Elena Voss and a delegation of Republic representatives drawn from a dozen human colonies, each of them carrying their own memo, their own worn and folded piece of evidence, their own quiet story of a life ground down by an empire too large, and too certain of itself to notice the cost. They asked for the things they had always asked for: fair quotas that accounted for the actual cost of mining a world's resources, rather than simply the resources themselves. Hospitals reopened and properly funded. The right of colonial worlds to elect their own local representatives, with real authority, rather than accept empire-appointed prefects who answered only to Kaloth. Recognition, formal and permanent, of the Terran Republic as a legitimate government, not a rebellious labor force to be managed but a people to be dealt with as equals. Minister Thess resisted some of it, quietly and stubbornly, the old habits of a lifetime not disappearing simply because a fleet had arrived to challenge them. But General Vantor, whose cold, practical arguments had swayed the council once already, argued for compromise at every turn, reminding the council again and again that an empire capable of fighting wars at its outer borders for decades could not now afford a second, closer conflict against an enemy who had already shown both the capability and the restraint to make such a conflict devastating. Prefect Elon Dre was called before the negotiating table on the fourth day, and it was there, facing Elena Voss directly for the first time, that he was shown the memo he had written 11 years before, worn soft and gray from a decade of folding and unfolding, carried across the width of known space, inside the jacket of a woman who had once been a 16-year-old girl, watching her grandmother's lungs fail in a mining tunnel he had never once bothered to visit. He read it in silence for a long moment, his own words looking strange and cold to him now, and when he finally looked up, his face had lost the mild, bored certainty it had carried for 11 years running that colony. "I wrote this the same afternoon," he said quietly, "and I never thought of it again." "I have thought of it every day since," Elena said, "for 11 years." Dre did not defend himself. He resigned his post that same week, the first Empire prefect in 300 years, to step down over the treatment of a colonial world. And though it changed nothing about the 40 lives already lost, it meant something to the people of New Haven who heard the news, a small, imperfect acknowledgement that their grief had finally been seen. On the 11th day, the Council of 12 and the representatives of the Terran Republic signed what came to be known across the galaxy as the Kaloth Accord, a document that granted every major demand the Republic had carried into negotiations, along with a formal apology, read aloud by Minister Thess himself in the same pale hall where Marcus Wren had once been laughed at, for what the document called generations of administrative indifference toward human life. It was not, everyone involved understood, a perfect peace. Old prejudices did not disappear because a document was signed. There were Empire citizens who resented the accord bitterly, who saw it as a humiliation forced on them by rebellious colonial labor, and there were Republic voices who argued the accord did not go nearly far enough. That formal apology was cheap compared to 50 years of stolen labor and lost lives. Elena Voss knew, standing in that hall as the final signatures were made, that the work of actually building something better was only beginning, and that it would likely take generations more before the wounds of the past truly closed. But something had changed, undeniably and permanently. The Terran Republic existed now, openly, recognized, no longer a whispered story passed in the dark, but a government that stood as an equal at the negotiating table of the oldest empire in known space. Human colonies across a dozen systems would wake the next morning to news that their quotas were being eased, their hospitals reopened, their right to govern themselves finally acknowledged in law rather than only in stubborn hope. Kes Balerian resigned his commission 3 months later, not out of anger, but because he found he could no longer imagine serving in a navy built on the same assumptions that had nearly gotten his entire crew killed through simple, arrogant blindness. He took a position instead with the new Joint Empire-Republic Liaison Office, working alongside Republic officers he had once been trained to think of as barely capable of running a mining colony, let alone a fleet that had crossed the width of known space undetected for 50 years. He met Ordis Fell for a drink one evening, back at the same dockside restaurant on Arath where he had once joked about a Terran fleet he did not believe existed. "Do you remember what Torvin said?" Ordis asked him. "That night, before all of this, about the Terran stock having more imagination than sense." "I remember," Kes said quietly. "Where is Torvin now?" Kes was silent for a moment. "Still in the Navy," he said. Still angry about the accord, he thinks we should have fought harder instead of negotiating. Fought harder against a fleet that could have killed all of us and chose not to? I know, Kess said. I told him the same thing. He didn't want to hear it. He looked out at the calm, wide harbor, the same view he had once enjoyed without ever once thinking about the people whose labor had built the ship he served on, whose ore had powered half the Empire's industry for 200 years. I think some people will never really see them, Ortis. No matter what happens, it's easier to keep believing the old story than to admit you were wrong for your entire life. And you? Ortis asked. Do you see them now? Kess thought of the Republic medical officer who had treated his wounded crew with the same careful attention she gave her own fleet, expecting nothing in return, not even gratitude. He thought of Admiral Voss's voice on that first broadcast, plain and controlled, and utterly without the cruelty he had half expected from an enemy fleet arriving at the gates of the capital. I think, he said slowly, that I finally understand what it means to actually look at someone, instead of just deciding in advance what they must be. Elena Voss returned to New Haven 8 months after the Kaloth Accord was signed, the first time she had set foot on her home world in over a decade. The mines were still there, still hard and dangerous work, but the quotas had eased, the hospitals had reopened, and a local council, elected by the people of New Haven themselves rather than appointed from Kaloth, now had real authority over how the colony's resources were managed. She walked to the edge of the mining pits where she had stood as an 11-year-old girl, watching Empire ships pass overhead like slow gray clouds, feeling a shame she had not yet had a word for. The sky above her now was clear and quiet, no ships at all, Empire or otherwise, just the ordinary blue of a planet's own honest afternoon. Marcus found her there, as she had somehow known he would. It's strange, she said, without turning around. I spent so many years imagining this moment. I thought it would feel bigger than this. Peace usually does feel smaller than the fight that won it, Marcus said, coming to stand beside her. That's not a failure. It just means the fighting is finally over, and what's left is only the ordinary, quiet work of actually living. Elena thought of her grandmother, buried now on this same world, who had spent her whole life believing in a flag that was only a bedtime story, never knowing it was real, never knowing that the granddaughter she used to hold in the dark would one day carry that flag across the width of known space and bring it home again, flying openly at last, over a sky that no longer belonged to indifference. I wish she could have seen this, Elena said quietly. Maybe she does, somehow, Marcus said. Or maybe it doesn't matter whether she sees it. Maybe it only matters that it's true now, because people like her never stopped believing it could be, even when there was no evidence at all that they were right. Elena reached into her jacket, where she still carried, out of a habit she had never quite been able to break, the old memo about administrative regret, worn now almost to nothing from 11 years of folding and unfolding. She took it out, looked at it one last time, and then, gently, she let it go, watching the wind of her homeworld carry it off across the mining pits where it had all begun. It's over, she said, and for the first time in 11 years, she found she believed it completely. Above them, the sky of New Haven stayed clear and blue and quiet, belonging, finally, to no one but the people who lived beneath it.